Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, this is the Inept General, and welcome to some Total War Warhammer 2 news. As many of you may be aware, I had the chance to visit Creative Assembly at their studios, and they were kind enough to let me have a go at Total War Warhammer 2, namely their E3 demo, which they have coming up, known as the Battle of the Fallen Gates. And to see my video and my impressions on that battle, which is one of several videos I'm releasing today, do check the top right hand corner now. There's also a video gone live on the news that Creative Assembly just released themselves an hour or so ago on their new free-for-all multiplayer mode. To see my thoughts and how that will work in Total War Warhammer 2, again, top right hand corner now, or find the link in the description below. But today, guys, in this video, we are going to look at all the news they gave us at that meeting with Creative Assembly about how the campaign will work in Total War Warhammer 2. So let's kick things off by talking about the broad strokes roughly. As many of you may already know, the campaign in Total War Warhammer 2 is going to feature around the Vortex, which is a massive magical spell that sucks out all the excess chaos energy from the world in the Warhammer world, keeping chaos from reaching its full strength and taking over the entirety of the world. Now, the aims of the different races and factions in Total War Warhammer 2 is either to stabilize that vortex or to destabilize it, kind of bringing around the apocalypse of sorts. Now, the way this works, we've got a few more details on that in the meeting we have with Creative Assembly. The way this is going to work is there's going to be a series of rituals, and each faction has different rituals they need to get through, effectively moving along a progression bar, which you can see where all the other factions are on along the way, until you get to an endpoint and a final battle and confrontation that effectively ends the narrative of the campaign in Total War Warhammer 2. Now, a lot of things Creative Assembly said that may have confused some people early on is if that's the way the game's played, but you guys have said to us that we actually don't need to participate in any of this Vortex stuff when we are playing Total War Warhammer 2. So the way that works, it seemed like a juxtaposition there for a bit, but they've explained it to us now. The way that's going to work is if you don't want to take part in any of the rituals, you just want to play like a normal Total War game, you just conquest territories, you make diplomatic deals, you're not too bothered about the Vortex. Effectively what happens is the AI can beat you to that ultimate goal, but once they reach that point, you are then brought into a fight against the AI, whereby you can overturn their victory. So you don't have to necessarily participate in the Vortex stuff, but if they beat you to it, the end battle becomes, I believe, a much tougher fight than it would have otherwise been if you'd beat them to the progression rather than the other way round. And that's kind of, you end up being given the choice of one final showdown at the end of your campaign, having ignored the rest of the ritual stuff throughout. So that's how it's optional. It's still there, it's still present, it's still very central in the way the campaign's going to work in Total War Warhammer 2, but that's the way that's going to play out. So you can ignore it, you can play just however you want. The game won't be sort of immediately campaign over when the enemies reach the end of their ritual or vortex progression. So having said that, let's talk about some of the other new stuff I got to see at Creative Assembly. So they started off their presentation, guys, with a fantastic flyover. Now, the flyover did not cover the entirety of the area of the Southlands, of Araby, of Nehekara, of Lustria, of Naggaroth, which are all the areas that are expected to be covered in Total War Warhammer 2. Instead, what we got were two flyovers of two different regions. We got flyover of Ulthuan, and we got a flyover of Lustria. So at the moment, it seems that they're not too keen to show off too much of Naggaroth just yet. I imagine that will be coming up a bit later, neither Araby or the Southland. So we'll have to wait and see what that ends up looking like. So let's tackle what Ulthuan looked like first. Ulthuan was a fantastic flyover, looked beautiful, very reminiscent. A lot of the sites one might expect to see on Ulthuan. You had the Shrine of Asurion, which is the tiny little island in the south part of the inner sea there, guys. You had the Isle of the Dead. The Vortex looked enormous. It really did play a significant feature right in the middle there. Perhaps more visually impactful than I had perhaps imagined it in my own mind. But it is huge. And it doesn't sort of cover anything. It's sort of above the island, but it's a very big effect above the island. And that's going strong. So you got to see, and there are the inner and outer kingdoms. Now, for those of you who perhaps aren't that familiar with the High Elves, the idea is that Ulthuan has inner and outer kingdoms, with the outer kingdoms being on the outside of this mountain range that encircles the entirety of the island, and the inner kingdoms being on the inside. Now, between these, in the lore, there are a series of gates. I mean, a big conflagration of them is over here. You can see the Phoenix Gate, the Dragon Gate, the Unicorn Gate. But the idea is they kind of spread out all along the island of Ulthuan. Now, this comes into play in the Total War Warhammer 2 map, guys. There are gates, there are walls between the inner and outer kingdom. And to cross from the outer kingdoms to the inner kingdoms, it will take a siege battle. Now, we'll get into the details of what's going on with siege battles a little bit later in this video, but you will get a siege battle, specially done siege battle that will represent those gates, and you have to try and overcome those gates before you get into, let's say, the soft underbelly of the High Elf Island. So that's something to bear in mind. A great little attention to detail there. It looked really stunning. I saw sort of some things I could pick out was the White Tower that was there. It just looked great. Very impressed with the way Ulthuan looked. Perhaps not. There's a lot of detail in Ulthuan. There's a lot of different settlements and cities and kingdoms, and it perhaps won't be that chock-a-block because I think the Ulthuan thing. I got the impression it was very close up. But I got the impression Ulthuan won't be that huge on the map, so it won't have all the detail, but much like the Empire didn't have all the detail of all the things going on in the Empire, it still had a lot of the major features one might expect. So that's something to watch out for when you get a chance to play on Ulthuan. So yeah, it looked great. So then they moved on us to like some of the campaign points. And so Tyrion is starting on Ulthuan, Teclis is not. We'll get into where Teclis is starting later on. Now, for those of you who don't know, Tyrion and Teclis are the two starting legendary lords or main characters for the High Elf faction in Total War Warhammer 2. They will be the two characters you pick at the beginning of a campaign about where you start your campaign and what you want your first general to be like. So Tyrion, the more martially focused general, will be starting on Ulthuan. I'm not exactly sure where, but one can maybe surmise it's probably Avalon, but I wasn't 100% sure on that myself. But he is starting on Ulthuan, whereas his twin brother Teclis is not. If you'd like a bit of lore on those two, again guys, check the top right hand corner. There's a great story about them in one of my other videos, or even the description below. So after we got a chance to fly around Ulthuan, we got a bit of campaign news, and it's nothing we didn't already know. A lot of stressing the idea that the campaign of the High Elves is very much built upon using trade networks to establish spy networks and to really get an idea of what's going on in the rest of the Warhammer world. And this maybe does fit in quite well. It speaks to the isolationist nature of the High Elves. They like their things on Ulthuan. They will trade, and they like to have an idea of what's going on in the outside world. But there are sort of differing ideas on what the role of Ulthuan should be. Tyrion is very much more with the idea as a character that Ulthuan should just look after itself, whereas his twin brother Teclis really takes into consideration what's going on with the rest of the world. And that maybe plays quite nicely into the idea that he's abroad at this point in time, and that's where he starts his campaign. So again, yeah, as I said, guys, focusing very much on trade and spying seems to be the focus of the High Elf campaign and Tyrion and Teclis. Next, we had the flyover of Lustria. Now, Lustria, fantastic Lust jungle, ruined temple cities, complete temple cities, everything one might expect from Lustria itself. Now, the idea of the temple cities is quite interesting, guys, because we're presented with a new choice when any player approaches one of these temple cities, and that is that one can decide to recolonize it and rebuild the city, or one can do what they called excavating or delving into the depths looking for treasure. Now, what this entails is effectively a kind of mini text, choose your own adventure type scenario where you're presented with a number of different choices, and depending on the choices you've made, you'll get a reward, whether that's a trait or a magical item, or even perhaps an army ability, which is a new aspect brought into the armies in Total War Warhammer 2, which you can find out a bit more about in my battle impression video. As I mentioned, it will be appearing in the description below, or just visit my channel page. So you'll get a little text-driven adventure, and that will result in either something positive, like equipment or a positive trait, or something negative, like a negative trait, or something that adversely affects your army. So it's a fun little choice, and it brings a bit more of a cool little narrative spin on Total War Warhammer 2, building on the narrative aspects they had in the first game. And again, with the another little aspect is there will be events that occur. They mentioned an element known as special spawnings, which is the idea that lizard men aren't born in a regular way that maybe other races of the Warhammer world are. They're in fact all like pre-made in spawning pools designed by their gods, known as the Old Ones, to emerge at a certain time, for those of you who don't know any of this. And the idea is that Creative Assembly have played with is that, yeah, some events will occur where special spawnings, and you get essentially blessed units. So much like you had the blessed trebuchet with Bretonia, you will have like blessed cold ones who are just this special spawning. They'll have extra abilities. They'll be a little bit better than their regular counterparts. So not quite going as far as Regiments of Renown, which we had in Total War Warhammer 2, still just kind of like a generic upgrade from what the units look like normally. So maybe just units you want to keep hold of, you want to keep alive that little bit more, even though they aren't specifically named units like the Regiments of Renown we had in Total War Warhammer 1. So that's a cool little element for the Lizard Men as well. If you want to know how the Lizard Men play, which is the new faction I got to play in the E3 demo I spoke about, again, do check for the Battle Impressions link in the description below. So that about summed it up for Lustria. We had a lot of stuff going on. The campaign of the Lizard Men very much focused on the idea of reassembling the geomantic web. That seems to be what their rituals will be about to progress and to stabilize the vortex, is locating and conquering cities in specific areas of the map to reinforce the idea of the geomantic web, which is a web of energy, kind of like the idea of ley lines that we have in our own world, that like you can tap into the Earth's energy itself and make yourself more powerful. And it gives the Slan mage priests something to tap into and use their magical energies and allow them really to progress the efforts of the Lizard Men as a whole. So that's what their campaign will be based around. Now, we got Mazda Mundi. It looked like, because we got a flyover, and I was slightly disorientated at points because it's gotten really close at the map, but I think Mazda Mundi is starting in Hexoatl, which makes sense lore-wise. Kropgar, I think, is starting more southernly, perhaps near Itza, maybe around that kind of area, but he's a bit more south, a bit more in the hinterlands of the Lizard Men territories. And another character is Teclis. Now, again, I was slightly disorientated, but I'm sure Teclis is starting on this island chain off the coast of Lustria, which maybe implies we're going to see a lot more of Lustria than perhaps some had thought. So we're going all the way to the western edge of Lustria, and I think it's on one of these island chains that Teclis will be starting in terms of the other High Elf Legendary Lord. So there's a bit of news for you on Teclis. So that about sums it up for the flyover of Lustria. There's a couple more points I'll point back in, but I'm trying to separate this into kind of logical sections. So we're going to come back to a couple more things I saw when we flew over Lustria, but at a little bit of a later date. For now, yeah, as I said, the Lizard Men, the Geomantic Web, special spawnings, but let's move on to the sieges. Now, the sieges, unfortunately, guys, we are going to see a little bit of changing in the sieges in terms of the variation of sieges. So they have worked on a number of different other siege maps, but sieges as a whole are not changing terribly. There was no mention of layering, there was no mention of going deeper into the cities we see in the background. For the most part, sieges are going to be staying the same. Now, that will disappoint a few people, but I can understand it's kind of built into the game. It will take a significant overhaul, but we had hoped for maybe a few more layers of sieges, stuff like that. But we do know that map variation is playing an important part in Total War Warhammer 2. I've mentioned this in my battle impressions video, but we're looking at a return of river maps, of choke point maps. The AI has been worked in a way that it can take advantage of choke points. So even if it's a bridge over a cavern or a river or just a choke point between two walls, the AI now knows how to set up properly around those choke points, if not properly, at least well enough around those choke points to learn to hold them. Whereas the AI in Total War Warhammer 1, although some custom maps did have choke points, the AI wasn't really suited to do it. So map variation has been a huge thing they've been pressing on for Total War Warhammer 2, but sieges, for the most part, apart from just being maybe different layouts, will largely remain the same. We're not getting the full 360 siege we've perhaps had in things like Attila or Rome or Medieval. We're not going back to that. We are staying with the section of a city against a few walls concept. Now, having said that about sieges and map variation, an element that another lot of people were looking forward to, including myself, was perhaps the reintroduction of town battles, where you're not necessarily behind a wall, but you're in a town and you can use kind of the buildings of the town to set up defenses in streets to really fight that way. That's not really happening either, I'm afraid. There's no real, you're not in the center of town. What they have said, though, is with town battles, they're going to do what they do with city battles, where you're going to have the town actually you can see the town, you just can't go into the town. So at least now they're town adjacent rather than being in an open field in the middle of nowhere when someone's attacking a town. And they said maybe one or two buildings from the town might play into the map, but not to the extent where you had in previous Total War games, where you're fighting in the middle of a city. You'll have maybe one or two buildings to set up against, and that's it, really. It's not going to be the same unwalled town sieges we've had in previous Total War games, unfortunately, guys. So that's how kind of sieges and maps are going to work in Total War Warhammer 2. Now, settlements have changed a lot as well. So they've taken inspiration for settlements from some of the experimentation they did with the Wood Elves and the way the Wood Elf cities had a lot more slots. Now, all settlements in Total War Warhammer 2, all major settlements are going to have 8 slots, not quite as high as the 10 of the Wood Elves, and all minor settlements, I think they said, are going to have 6 slots. So that's the way it's going to work in Total War Warhammer 2. Major settlements, 8 slots. Minor settlements, 6 slots. So that introduces a couple of different elements we need to discuss. So that means there's a lot more variety in the types of buildings for the Total War Warhammer 2 races. So they'll have a lot more different types of buildings, a lot more legendary buildings, a lot more just special buildings for areas, as well as extra buildings. Now, a lot of you may have been jumping the gun and said, what about the combined map, where if you own Total War Warhammer 1 and Total War Warhammer 2, and there's the combined map coming after release, how will that play? And indeed, this is being actively rolled back into the combined Grand Campaign map for the first races of the game. So the Empire, the Undead, Beastmen, Wood Elves, all of them are, maybe not the Wood Elves, because the Wood Elves already have enough building variety, but for all the major races who build, so including the Undead, they'll get new buildings and they'll get access to a lot more legendary buildings on the Grand Combined Campaign map. So we're getting a little bit of a retroactive activity there. Now, I don't think this is going to be applied to people who just own Total War Warhammer 1. I think as far as that section of the game is gone, that is not being upgraded. But those races are being upgraded for when they're introduced into the Grand Combined Campaign in Total War Warhammer 2. Now, another element to bear in mind is what we are going to get into, which is the idea of regional occupation. Now, sorry guys, I'll just pull up my last slide there. I'll go back. This was just to highlight the idea of something I've already mentioned, the idea of bridges and choke points. This was a picture taken from the battle I did with EA. Again, guys, check the description below if you want my breakdown of how the battle was, how I feel the Lizardmen units play. But again, there's a bridge there. The High Elves were very good at setting up a choke point there. They got enough units. They spread across the whole way. They really did a good defense of that choke point. So there is that map variety. So what we are getting into now is the idea of regional occupation, hinted at that before. Now, a lot of you will already know this has been released, but regional occupation will not exist as it did in Total War Warhammer 1. You will not have, like, twinned up civilizations where you can only live in, like, say, undead and humans could only live in one type of city, and the dwarves and the greenskins could only live in another type of city. You can set up anywhere you want. Now, I made a video about my own theory about how this could possibly work, and it seems that Creative Assembly broadly were thinking along the same lines. Much like myself, they used the idea of the environment as the kind of limiting factor, if you will. So the different environments of the Warhammer world is what's going to determine how well races do in those areas. So lizardmen will do, one presumes, very well in jungle, whereas maybe even wood elves will do pretty well in the jungle as well. Who knows? But the idea is that you have deserts, you have mountains, you have forest, you have jungle, you have different types of environmental areas. Now, we didn't get a breakdown of what exactly these environmental areas are defined of as of yet, but that will be the aspect that depicts how well your race will do in that area. Now, what are the punishments? Like, what are the negatives of going to an environment where your race doesn't do very well? Now, they gave us only a couple of examples. Mine, in my own theory, regional occupation video. If you're interested in what I thought, do check the top right-hand corner now, or again, the description below for the link to my video. But what they've named to us as the limiting aspects was that construction time in environments that aren't suited to your race will be longer. Public order will be worse in the areas that aren't suited to you. And they said there's a whole other, like, plethora of different negative effects if you settle areas that aren't suited to your race. Now, I always stipulated that it might just be a lack of population growth. That could potentially be one of the limiting factors as well. We don't have a full list, but the only two we got for sure were construction time and public order would be adversely affected if you settle in an environment that isn't conducive to your race. Now, we don't know, as I said, we don't know what the breakdown of that was effectively. Now, when they told us this, I did ask, so if I would struggle to bring a city to its full potential, can I gift cities to other civilizations? And no, you can't. There's no gifting of settlements in Total War Warhammer 2, which is a little bit frustrating if you think about it, but that's just something that they said they haven't put into the game. Well, they didn't say as of yet, but they haven't put it into the game as of yet. So that's a bit of a shame, particularly if you're going to use these negative effects. But then that leads me to believe maybe these negative effects aren't that harsh. If they were hugely limiting, one would have to think they'd have to put gifting of settlements into the diplomacy options in Total War Warhammer 2. So there we go for regional occupation. Now let's talk about how some of the character upgrade stuff will work. Now let's talk about traits. The traits in Total War Warhammer 1 started, you could kind of tell they were for reasons, but we never really knew why. And then they brought in Bretonia. And in the Bretonian free LC, we got the idea of, like, you get this trait because you won an offensive battle or you've lost X amount of battles in a row. And it really just opened up to the reasons why you were getting these positive or negative traits. And they are going to use that system going forward for all the races of Total War Warhammer 2, whereby when you gain a trait, you'll be told how you got it. So that, I think, is a great development, and that will be obviously retroactively worked back into the Warhammer 1 races in the Grand Combined map, but not in the Warhammer 1 game. So these are all going to be rolled into Empire, Undead, Dwarves, Greenskins, Beastmen, all of the above, in the combined map of Total War Warhammer 2, but not Total War Warhammer 1. So just bear that in mind, guys. So that's the trait system for you. Now, the upgrade tree, this is just a picture of an upgrade tree, but really what I want to talk about here is magic. So magic upgrades are going to work very differently in Total War Warhammer 2. Now, I'm looking forward to seeing, we didn't get a demonstration of how this would work. We just got it described to us slightly, and I tried to delve a bit deeper, but it was a bit tricky to get a hold of exactly where they're going in terms of maybe increasing points available to you. So magic is not going to work the same way it worked in Total War Warhammer 1. If you have access to a lore of magic, you are not going to get access to all of those spells of magic. At least I don't think so. So what we're going to have instead is that magic itself is getting even more. You can spend even more points in magic now. So when you get a spell in the new upgrade trees for Total War Warhammer 2, the first time you spend a skill point on that spell, you get the use of that spell. Now, in Total War Warhammer 1, if you put another one in it, all it did was, I think, reduce the time for you to be able to reduce the cooldown. That's not the case anymore. Now there are several levels of upgrade to magic spells. First level, get the spell. Second level, get the overcast version of that spell. You won't have access to that at the beginning when you just get the spell. Third level is reduce the magic cost of that spell. So those are the 3 levels of every magic spell. So that's technically 3 skill points you can pour into one spell. Now, this leads me to think that they will give you a lot of options for, particularly, let's say, the Slann, the Lizardmen, and the High Elves have particularly strong magic users in their ranks. So one assumes that you will get access to either a selection of spells from different lores, or yes, a selection of spells from different lores, and you kind of just have to pick and choose. A bit more like the tabletop, where despite if you have access to a lore of magic, it doesn't mean you get all the spells of that lore of magic. You can only pick a few spells from that. And it seems that that's the direction they're going, where they'll give you access to several spells, but you'll never have enough skill points to have all the spells in sort of all the lores of magic your character has access to. You kind of have to pick and choose, which adds for a lot more variety in mage builds. But also for people who just wanted to build like power-mad mages with every spell of every lore of magic, like the Slann Mage Priest technically could have access to if they did magic the same way as they did in the first game. That's just not the case, guys, I'm afraid. So that's how magic's going to work, and it's going to mean you have less. I think it's in the end, it's going to mean, you have as many spells as one might have had in Total War Warhammer 1, but they're from a variety more different lores of magic, particularly for the High Elves and the Slann Mage Priests, than they would have been otherwise. So that's how your magic users might work. So that's a bit, particularly for the legendary Lord characters. For the other mages, they might just have them sticking to a lore of magic, much like mage heroes did in Total War Warhammer 1. But a lot more skill points need to be put into magic. That's just the way it seems to be working. But I suppose that's fair, because if you had a more combat-focused general, you'd be pouring a lot more skill points into his combat than you would have done into magic. Because magic, the cooldown thing, or if you're anything like me, you didn't ever bother with. So it might balance out in the end, but just something to bear in mind and something to keep an eye on going forward, guys. So the other thing I just wanted to quickly mention about characters that I had a slight query about was the idea of characters when they get equipment. Will the equipment show on their character model in battle? So if I don't have my character's like quest items yet, will they show up as something different when he's in battle? And I'm afraid, guys, that's not the case, at least not in Total War Warhammer 2. It's going to be exactly like Total War Warhammer 1. Your guy's going to look like he has all his legendary equipment from the beginning, despite the fact he doesn't. It's a bit of a shame, small cosmetic thing, but it just gives that idea of that little extra touch of polish. But unfortunately, we're not going to get it. I think they said it was an issue of memory in the game when I asked about it. But we are not going to get that equipable option in Total War Warhammer 2. Now, guys, let's talk a little bit about the old world races in Total War Warhammer 2. A lot of you know, and I've mentioned it several times in this video already, that the old world races will play a part in the combined Total War Warhammer 2 and Total War Warhammer and Total War Warhammer 2 maps, where you get that grand campaign map if you own both games. But what we haven't confirmed until today, where we've been allowed to release this information, is that the old world races are definitely appearing in the Vortex map, which is the only Total War Warhammer 2 map, but they will be non-playable. Even if you own Total War Warhammer 1, the races are non-playable, but they do appear. The one I did see for sure was I saw a tree man fighting a lizard man army in the forests of Lustria. So that's definitely something I saw, but we had confirmation that the other races will be appearing in some way, shape, or form as kind of antagonist races. You won't be able to play them, at least not at the start. So this is where my theory comes in, and I think this reinforces, if you guys are regular visitors to my channel, you'll know that I have a number of ideas about how they will make Lord packs, where they introduce legendary characters in Total War Warhammer 2, a way of reintroducing the old world races as playable factions in Total War Warhammer 2. To get my full thoughts on some of those, do check out my future DLC for Total War Warhammer 2 video, again popping up in the top right hand corner or in the description below. It's a fun little speculative video on what we might get, but it opens up the idea of a lot more legendary lords from those old races being reintroduced in Total War Warhammer 2, a way of keeping those going and allowing you to play as those races on the Total War Warhammer 2 campaign map. So, fun little idea, and I think it's been reinforced by the fact that we will be seeing the races as non-playable characters at the beginning in Total War Warhammer 2. Now, you might be like, oh, how's that going to work? That's a bit strange. And you are right in some cases. There are some lore of places where the old races can easily be based out of. And they did mention that some of the old world races do have colonies and will be living in those colonies in the new world. Now, the two they mentioned at first were Skeggi, which is a Norscan colony at the very northern end of Lustria. So they mentioned that by name. They said there's a colony there in Skeggi, which is a Norscan colony. So we may still see the Norscans coming out of there. There is also the one they mentioned directly that I'm super excited about, which was the Vampire Coast. Now, I'm not going to fool myself. There's no way they introduced Ulthuan off the bat, who is a famous vampire pirate who has a fleet, effectively, of zombie crew who maraud the seas around this part of the world. If you want the full lore on Ulthuan, do check the top right-hand corner now, or the description below, and they'll give you a full story. And he has a very different undead army than the vampire counts. They have cannon, they're really an interesting army to get into. But I don't think they'll be implemented. I think this will just be a vampire count faction, a generic one to start with. But it does open the window for there to be a Ulthuan DLC, which I'm very excited about, guys. And this is the one they mentioned by name. So super excited about that. Now, others we may have, depending on how much of the Southlands and Araby we get, there is Sudenburg, which is an empire colony that exists just south of Araby, but it's empire, completely empire owned. The empire still live there. It's an empire colony just on the sort of underbelly of Araby. So that's where the empire could be based out of. And of course, there is the legendary Lost Karak of Karak Zorn, the Dwarven Karak, which is said to be the founding city of the dwarves lost millennia ago, so to the point that the dwarves aren't even sure where it is, but it does appear on Warhammer maps. But it's the legendary home city capital of the ancient Dwarven Empire, but it's been lost to the lands south of the Badlands. So that could be a starting position for a generic band of lost dwarves. Now, as for the others, a bit trickier. I mean, we have the Beastmen and Chaos. Easy, they're horde armies, doesn't really matter where they pop up from at the moment. You have greenskins. Now, we've seen greenskin hordes pop up in the first game, so we can just have greenskin hordes, one can assume. But in a game where everyone can take every settlement, I suppose it doesn't matter. You could just say the greenskins are set up in one of the ruined cities. They have been known to trample through the jungles of Lustria before. So there we go. We'll have the greenskins. And so everything else you could kind of excuse as a horde. Wood elves is a bit trickier to pull off. Like that, you could just say there's some living trees in the forest of Lustria, and they're led by the tree men, not having any connection to the wood elves. One could make that argument, not really, but stretch one's imagination. So yeah, that's why we might have the tree men wandering around the forest of Lustria as well. So, yep, old world races will be making an appearance in the campaign of Total War Warhammer 2, as well as, of course, the combined campaign map if you own both games. Hope that clears it up, and it opens up huge exciting potential for DLC as well. So, last thing I will really want to talk about is the naval mechanics. Now, we know there's no naval combat in Total War Warhammer 2. A couple of things we did see is they showed us like ships crossing the sea, and there are a couple of features on the sea to make it a bit more interesting. There are kind of roving storms that will do damage to you. There's reefs which can impede where you maybe make landings. There's also the idea of sunken treasure ships. Now, the sunken treasure ships will work similarly to the way I described excavating the temple cities. It'll be a little choose your own adventure, little text thing. You'll get multiple choices, and you'll be rewarded with something or punished with something depending on the choices you made. Now, these aren't completely randomized. Once you learn all of them, you'll know how to answer all of them. But they say there's a lot of them, so it'll be quite some time before you get through them all. So a couple of features there. No monsters appearing in the game, unfortunately. There are a great selection of sea monsters within the Warhammer world that feature quite prominently, but alas, we won't be seeing any of them in Total War Warhammer 2, other than maybe just a cosmetic feature, maybe swimming about, but they won't be interactable. But you will have to watch out for storms, for reefs, for buried ship, for sunken ships that you can delve into for treasure or traits or whatever you end up getting out of them. And that's really how the mechanics will work. No mention of anything about raiding as of yet, in terms of how raiding might work offshore or any mechanics around that. As you guys who are regular visitors to my channel know, I have a fear that raiding might cause you just to have to spam spearman armies to send them out to sea to just have them chase off enemy ships, enemy AI ships, which isn't any fun for anybody. But that's one of my concerns going forward, and something I'll maybe try and follow up on if I get a chance to talk to CA about it again. But yeah, so that's how some of the naval mechanics we've been introduced to so far, just to try and make naval travel a little bit more interesting as you go from one continent to another. Now, the last thing I want to talk about are the races that sort of haven't really been mentioned in this part, which are, we presume, the Skaven, no confirmation as of yet, and the Dark Elves. Now, the only bit of information we were able to get about the Dark Elves, really, rather than any confirmation of Skaven, which we haven't had as of yet, is that I asked about a slavery mechanic in the Dark Elves, and the answer was simply, it would be strange to have a Dark Elf faction with no slaves featuring in it. So we'll get slaves featuring in the Dark Elf army to some little bit, but that's all I could really squeeze out of them for these armies that weren't mentioned, guys. But that about sums it up, really. Hope you guys enjoyed that. There's a lot of new information there about how the campaign will work in Total War Warhammer 2. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Do drop a like if you did. Do subscribe for more Total War Warhammer content. Check out some of my gameplay videos, some of my lore videos on the channel, guys. And as always, a special thank you to my patrons, John, Reese, Colin, Thomas, Mateus, Samuel, Matthews, David, and Peter. Thank you, guys. And again, thank you all for watching, and I look forward to catching you on the next one.